Well, that was quite the race, and in this video I'm going to break down exactly what was going on with Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen during this weekend's Italian Grand Prix. Before we get into the incident at turn 2, I think it's really important to look at some past examples of what happened between Lewis and Max. And first of all, take a look at what happened actually right at the start of the race, going into the second chicane. So here we can see Max and Lewis alongside each other. Max has got up the inside. They're both super late on the brakes and they're coming into turn 3. You can see here that both drivers are alongside each other. And what's really important when you're the driver on the inside, when you're in Max Verstappen's position here, is that you just try to maintain just being ahead of the driver on the outside. If you're not ahead of them, then they control the corner around the outside. If they have their front wheel just slightly in front of yours, you cannot then push them wide. And what Max is probably doing at this point is just rolling up, coming up off the brake pedal just a fraction so that he can send a bit more speed into turn 3, stay ahead of Lewis Hamilton and push him wide. And that, of course, is exactly what he did. He actually missed the apex by half a car's width at turn 3, stayed ahead of Lewis Hamilton. You can see by this point that he is slightly ahead, and it's very obvious where Max Verstappen is going to go at this point. He's moving the car to the outside. His trajectory is not on the typical racing line that you might see around here. His trajectory is actually coming through here. He's missed the apex and he's going to run right out here because he wants to move Lewis Hamilton very early, move him out of track. And what's important to note here is just look at how early in the corner Max is running to the outside of the track. Lewis has no option at this point to even consider getting up the inside for turn 4. He's got to go over that extra runoff area. And then, as we know, we do see that happen. Lewis is going into the runoff area to cut across the inside of turn 4 quite early in that section of track. And before we go into the next part, let me just run on board with Lewis Hamilton here. And I wanted to point this out because look at the trajectory of his car here. It's very obvious where he's going to go. Max on the inside of the corner here is controlling the corner. He's ahead. He's just going to open up that steering wheel and run Lewis Hamilton wide. Now, whether this is fair or not depends on your position as a fan or as a driver. I tend to be more on the aggressive side. We're all competitive drivers. And so I think that if you do have your nose ahead, you can just lean on the driver on the outside. Lewis would have known that Max was going to have this aggressive style going into this turn, but he wanted to see if he could get slightly ahead around the outside and actually begin to control the corner. And of course, we've seen something like this before in Italy, actually at Imola earlier in the year, at that wet race where again, Lewis was on the outside and Max ran him wide, ran him off the track early in the corner, pushed him onto that runoff. So let's run over this incident at Monza very quickly before we go over each driver's perspective. If you're wondering why I'm wearing this lovely McLaren top, firstly, it's because I'm a big fan of Lando and Daniel and I wanted to celebrate their incredible 1-2. But secondly, it's to thank this video's sponsor, Fuel for Fans, who make officially licensed Formula 1 kit for the majority of the teams on the F1 grid, including Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull, and McLaren. They sell top quality jackets, t-shirts and soft shells, as well as loads of other kit. They've got a massive range and the kit is genuinely really nice. So if you want to support your favourite driver or team, be sure to check them out. For 20% off, use code DRIVER61 at checkout, which you can find in the link in the description below. Now back to the video. Hamilton had come out the pits. Max had already done a lap or two on his tyres and was up to speed and sent it around the outside. Lewis was coming out the pits, so he was on the inside and Max went around the outside. Then at the apex, which Lewis actually made compared to Max when he didn't make the apex at the start of the race, Lewis is half a car in front and Max is winging it around the outside, hoping that he can get his nose ahead to then nip up the inside going into turn 2. And this, of course, is where all the problems begin. We've got Lewis slightly ahead of Max here, Max on the outside. And from this perspective, you can see that obviously this gap is going to turn into a wedge and it's going to be incredibly tight. And then, as we've seen in all the replays, Max runs over this sausage curb on the inside, which sends the car off the ground a little bit, and then he just basically very awkwardly crashes into Lewis Hamilton before the rear tyres connect and they take off. So let's look at this from Max Verstappen's perspective. Hamilton's just come out the pits. Max has had a terrible stop, costing him 10 or 11 seconds. Although I've heard a few people talking about, well, the pit stop then influenced Max's decision here to overtake and be a bit more aggressive. I don't agree with that at all. These drivers are massive professionals, and as soon as something bad happens, that just goes out of their brain. This scenario of overtaking a driver is very in the moment, and if there's a space, you will go for it. And there's such a complex of variety and different things that can happen that you've got no room to actually be upset or angry. These drivers are working at a much higher level than that. So Max is around the outside. Lewis has positioned himself really well. Max has positioned himself really well. Now in this position, Lewis is giving him some room. If I were Max, I would go around the outside as he is doing here and try to hang it out for as long as I possibly can. Because at some point, Lewis can't squeeze him anymore as they turn into turn 2. The space there, he's still got an option. The only issue with taking this risk around the outside is that then the other driver, Lewis in this case, begins to squeeze you on the inside of the corner. And by this point, you're pretty much trapped. There's not that much that you can do. You would have to almost like stop the car here to allow Lewis to go around the outside. And so that's the risk with going around the outside in a corner like this, is that you get trapped on the inside if the other driver isn't doing what you would expect. So to be clear, most drivers, I believe, would have done exactly the same as what Verstappen has done here. And if you look at his positioning, there isn't very much space down the right-hand side here. Perhaps he could move a little bit further across, but as we know, they had rear-to-rear contact with the tyres. So there certainly wasn't much space on the right-hand side for Verstappen to go into. And for me, this final slide demonstrates the only place where Verstappen could have perhaps been a little bit less aggressive. Now, it's very easy for me to look at these slides or watch some of the slow-mo replays and have an opinion because it's all happening very slow. When you're in the heat of the moment and it's all happening very quick, it's a lot more difficult. And to be fair with Verstappen, he didn't know how much space he was going to have across this section of track because that was all in Lewis's hands. But where he could have potentially been a little bit less aggressive is when he knew that he was going to be going across the sausage curb on the left. He could have slowed the car down just a little bit more because of course if you hit that sausage curb you can expect the front of the car to come up off the track a little bit and therefore step wide and potentially into your opponent Lewis Hamilton on the outside of the track. And I think this is probably what Verstappen got the little penalty for, was being a little bit too aggressive in this part of his potential overtaking manoeuvre. However, it is a very difficult thing to judge, I have to say. I think that I would have done pretty much exactly the same and taken that risk, especially when it was critically important for Verstappen to get back past Hamilton at this point in the race. So now let's take a look at this from the perspective of Lewis Hamilton. He's come out the pits and he probably thought that he was going to actually be easily clear of Norris and Verstappen. However, he's come out alongside. His positioning here on the track is absolutely perfect. He's made Verstappen go around the outside. Of course, you don't want to let that driver come up the inside of you because then you are just giving up the corner. He's made Verstappen go around the outside. He's slightly ahead, so he's off the brakes. He's turning the car into the corner. He's controlling turn 1. But for me, this is where he's probably been a little bit fairer than Max or a little bit less aggressive than Max might have been. So as you can see here at the apex, Lewis has made this apex on the inside of the corner. Remember, going back to Imola, going back to the start of this race at Monza, Verstappen did the same thing, but he missed the apex. He let the car move a little bit wide to force the driver on the outside. So this is where Lewis potentially could have done something slightly differently. He could have rolled off the brakes a little bit earlier, kept Max there on the outside, but started his trajectory to the outside of the circuit much earlier. And again, when we move to this on board, you can see, as I've mentioned before, there is space there for Verstappen. What I believe Lewis should have actually done was been right out here he had his left-hand wheel right out here, so Max had no option other than to disappear down the runoff on the left-hand side here. That is exactly what Max had done to Lewis. Now, I know a lot of people say, oh, you should leave a car's width on the outside, but please don't forget that these guys, they're racing drivers, they're aggressive, they're forceful, and this is how we have been racing for all of our lives. This is what we do in karting, this is what we do in junior formula. This is the agreement that drivers have, where if you're on the outside and the other driver is ahead of you, you generally get shoved out onto the grass or out onto the runoff. And I don't actually quite understand why Lewis didn't push Verstappen wider here. We've seen him do it in the past. He's an aggressive, forceful driver. So I don't know why on this occasion he didn't quite get all the way across. Perhaps it's because turns 1 and 2 at Monza are very, very tight, especially turn 2. So if you're already right out here, it makes the left-hander super, super tight here going through turn 2. So perhaps that had something to do with it. But what he's done here, what Lewis has done here, is allowed a space that Verstappen is going to try to get through. He's left it in this kind of grey area, whereas if he'd have driven him off the track much earlier, he would have dispatched him onto the runoff and then had a clear line through. When you leave this kind of no man's land in the middle where a driver may go for it or may not, especially going through a tight turn like turn 2, you leave it open to having a crash and making contact like these guys did. And then again, that is shown by this slide here, where there's some space on the inside. Hamilton's left a bit of space here, but not quite enough, but then not enough to make it very clear that there's nowhere to go. And so that's why Verstappen got himself into this position, because it might have come off. What you've got to remember is that Verstappen doesn't know what Hamilton is going to do next. So he left in the space at the mid-corner through the right-hander, and then he could have opened up the left-hander and given Verstappen space and tried to fight on the way out of the corner. So whose fault was this contact that ended both of their races? Well, I don't often say this. Usually I do assign some kind of level of blame to a driver, because I do believe that a lot of the time one of them has made a mistake or made a misjudgment somewhere. But on this occasion, it's very awkward. I know that Verstappen got the penalty for the next race, but I would have done the same. I would have gone around the outside as well. There was an opportunity there. The only thing that Lewis did wrong was that actually he wasn't quite aggressive enough in the mid part of this chicane to push Verstappen out, if that is a way that you can be wrong, of course. So I think that this was a racing incident. It's almost a miscommunication between the drivers, where Verstappen thought that he might have been able to get through, but Lewis was always going to close that gap down. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out these other videos that we think you'll love. Thank you very much for watching, and please make sure you subscribe to the Driver 61 channel for these F1 breakdowns. Cheers, and see you next time.